Hey everyone, it's Tyler Putman. I'm back with one of our Artisan Field Trips, part of the Museum of the American Revolution's Living History at Home series. I'm really excited to be traveling to Virginia today. We're meeting with Aislinn Lewis, a blacksmith. Hey Aislinn, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, Tyler. Sure. So my name is Aislinn Lewis. I'm a blacksmith in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I got started in the trade in high school. I was volunteering at a local historic site that had a blacksmith shop, which was kind of the perfect way to introduce you to a kind of an unusual trade in some ways. People know a lot about it, from television or from books, but they don't really maybe know the nitty gritty of the actual trade. So it was neat to be able to be exposed to that. So really became a pretty obsessive hobby all through high school. And then I ended up studying it in college, the American College of the Building Arts, and then went through an apprenticeship program at Colonial Williamsburg. So I'm a journeyman blacksmith there now.
Am I right in saying that a journeyman is someone who's completed an apprenticeship and in the 18th century would have been kind of a free agent? Is that fair to say?
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, apprenticeships are contractual agreements with miners. They're being educated and provided for during that time. And then, of course, yeah, as you say, once you become a journeyman, typically over 21, you can go work for whoever you want, and you're entitled to a wage at that point.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about in relation to this interview and what we could talk about was what people probably imagine when they picture a blacksmith in the 18th century. He's probably like a big burly dude with, maybe shaved in a while. And he's probably hitting like a horseshoe. But some of the objects we have on display in the museum and some of the people who worked in the trade in the 18th century look nothing like that. So could you tell us a little about like what do we know about blacksmiths in history and blacksmithing today?
Sure. So blacksmiths historically, they do tend to be thought of as dealing with horses and things like that. But more often, blacksmiths are dealing with tooling and hardware that people need for daily tasks. So, I'm from the Tidewater of Virginia. Farming is big here, as it is in most parts of the country. So most blacksmiths here were really focusing heavily on agricultural equipment, repair and maintenance, and manufacture. You also have, of course, sort of the ubiquitous household goods, cooking tools and gardening equipment. And then, there's other trades that need tooling and hardware for their work. So a trade, for example, like a wheelwright, if you're thinking about constructing a vehicle, you do need, literally all the nuts and bolts to hold it together. So there's a huge array of ironwork, but it's not always the most flashy or the most noticeable initially on a building. It's often those little things that are kind of holding something else up. It's really only when it's in those really big sort of ornamental ironwork pieces like gates and railings that people really tend to notice it.
And what about the sort of people we know did blacksmithing work? How did race and gender play into this trade?
So you see predominantly men working in the trade, but as far as people of all sorts, they do show up. Often women are involved in trades and family businesses. And so in North America, particularly in the 18th century, most family shops are pulling everybody in at some point. So it's hard to find hard and fast records of them, because unless you show up in a court document or something like that, or you inherit a business and you're actually the proprietor, there's really no reason for your name to be recorded. Unless it's just incidentally for some reason. So finding those specific examples and being able to follow someone through their entire career and education is rare for most people, but it's even harder for women or enslaved people, or really anybody who's not, as I say, the owner of the business.
I think some folks might have seen in the museum, or they can explore even in our virtual museum. We have a couple pieces made at the Rappahannock Forge, for example, which were almost certainly made by enslaved workers, but we only know that because we have the object that's marked and some documentary records that suggest how the labor forces worked there. So it is really exciting to try to fill in that void, I think, sometimes with those sources that we wish had more material.
It is, and being able to get a lot of disciplines looking at the same question, I think has really helped to kind of flesh that out.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I guess maybe a discipline or a type of work that you're doing is kind of experimental archaeology, right? It's looking at original things, trying to recreate them. So, do you have particular projects that you're excited about or proud of having made as a blacksmith?
Um, Usually whatever project I'm in the middle of at that moment is is kind of the most exciting, and then towards the end of it, you're kind of ready for the next thing to show up on the bench. But I think some of the projects that are the most interesting to me are pulling objects that people don't normally think of when they think of forging. So, for example, there was a really neat little piece of equipment or accessory, I should say, called a key swivel, and they've got a little catch on them, and they're very small, very decorative, what we call bright work at the time, heavily polished. And there's whole trades, metalworking trades that manufacture these at the time. But they're an object that does have forging as its basis, and it's not something that people really think of when they think of the work of on an anvil. So this is a example. I don't know if you can see that here, but it's got a little catch in it, little spring, and that would just hang on your apron string or something along those lines and hold something like a key, or other things that you need close at hand. You also see them being used in some military contexts, as well as for things like hooking dog collars together. So
That's really interesting to think about some of the things that do require a lot of careful finesse and might be different than what we imagine. One other thing I was curious about is if there are things that blacksmiths could do in the 18th century or materials they had access to that we don't necessarily have today, and how, as a modern craftsperson, you work within those limitations, or maybe use things that didn't exist in the 18th century to expand your abilities.
So the trade in the 18th century and the trade today, in their essentials, are very similar. We're still heating the iron and steel. We're still using a hammer to change the shape. The power source for your tools might change. Air powered, electrical powered, all of those sorts of things. But one of the biggest challenges we have is actually sourcing iron. We say iron kind of broadly, but when you really get down to what iron is, it's what we today call wrought iron. So it's actually it's almost pure iron. It has some silica inclusions in it from the manufacturing process, and it behaves quite differently than a modern mild steel. So a lot of people who are making quote ironwork today might actually be using a mild or a softer steel rather than the iron, and it has a very homogeneous sort of texture to it as opposed to the iron. So it poses some different challenges as far as how you forge it. Overarching, very similar, but there's some technical things that you have to change. So as someone who does a lot of work with historic ironwork, when you're making an object from that time period, using the right material does give you a very unique window into how it was made. Because you might make a choice as to technique based on how that material is going to behave. So if you can get the right material, it's ideal. So finding that is really a matter of being good at finding scrap. So you have to look for old buildings or vehicles or things like that are being torn down or repurposed in some way, and be able to spot that iron and pull it in.
I love that idea of like looking for raw material in the built environment, sourcing things that already exist. I'm really excited that because we are doing this virtually, we actually get to see your shop, which I think combines historical things, contemporary things. So would you mind taking us out there for a visit and maybe a demonstration of something?
Sure, absolutely. Well, welcome to my shop. So I'm going to show you guys how to make a nail. But before I do that, I thought I'd show you really just one of the few essential tools that all blacksmiths, historical or modern, really have at their disposal. And you might hear a couple of my chickens in the background. They're excited about this too. So if you walk this way, you see here really just have a basic workbench, and the post vise is really a big part of our ability to do finish work using a file that allows us to actually polish the surface of the material so that it's a bright silver color, which gives it, in a lot of cases, a very decorative effect. Now, stepping over here, this is really the part of the forge that most people think of. So you've got, in this case, a coal-burning fire. Fires like this get extremely hot, up around 3,000 degrees when there's air blowing into them. So they're more than enough to get iron to a soft, very plastic state. Over here we have the anvil. This is my primary work surface. And then, of course, the hammer, which is going to allow you to apply pressure and shape the material. Now, I do have in this shop an electric blower rather than a set of bellows or a hand crank blower. So it will introduce a little bit of noise into the equation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on now. So I've stuck a piece of small material, typically what we would refer to as nail rod. It's roughly 1/4 inch square material. It's ideal for making nails. So that will be placed in the fire, and that will heat up to a temperature range a couple thousand degrees. So you can see it's already starting to glow. So I want to get this as hot as possible without burning it so that I have the longest working window possible. Now I pull it out, the anvil, quickly squeeze out a long narrow taper on the end of that bar, create a couple of shoulders to define the length of the shank of the nail and where the head's going to be. Trim that with this chisel. And then break it away into a tool called a nail header. And that gives me access to the top of the nail. And that is a nail. So you can make them very quickly, and they're something that would have been made by professional nailers at the time, and occasionally by general blacksmiths.
Aislinn, that was a really exciting shop tour and demonstration. I really appreciate you showing us around and giving us some insights in blacksmithing in the 18th century and today.
Oh, well, thank you. It was a really fun opportunity.
Thanks again to everyone enjoying this version of our Artisan Field Trip, part of our Living History at Home series. Check out more of them online at AmRev Museum.